One for joining us today for this webinar. It's certainly one that I'm excited to host and participate in. I think it's obviously very timely. We're just a few days after the, sort of the extreme heat and heat dome that we experienced last year. And of course, we've just experienced more heat, not as extreme, but more heat here in British Columbia and across the country. We've also been listening to really extreme heat in other parts of the world, in India, et cetera. So I think this is an ongoing issue in the context of climate change. I'm really excited today to share this space with our presenters. We've got 4 great guest speakers today. And I'm going to give them a brief introduction just before they speak. I also just want to acknowledge where we are joining you from. I think most of us, I live and work and occasionally play on the lands of the Kosomson and Lekwungen families and ancestors who have shepherded this land and the oceans and air and water that we rely on and enjoy for millennia. And it's with deep gratitude that I feel very privileged to be here and very privileged to be able to join you from this space. I don't know if you all know what lands you're on, but feel free to share that with us in the chat room. I think it's really important that we increasingly acknowledge where we are, especially in this disembodied environment of Zoom, where we can sort of forget that we actually have bodies and that we're actually living in space and time. Anyway, as you do that, I'm going to also do some brief introductions to guest speakers, and then we'll launch in. I'm going to start with Dr. Sarah Henderson, who is the Scientific Director of Environmental Health Services at the BC Centre for Disease Control and the Scientific Director of the National Collaboration Centre for Environmental Health. She has been working in this space of studying and making recommendations around heat and extreme heat for almost 15 years and has done some really important research with colleagues on last year's extreme heat, which she'll be sharing with us today as part of what she brings to this presentation. So super excited to hear from you, Sarah, and I know you're going to bring lots of really important information to this discussion. Next, I want to introduce Brooks Hogya. Brooks is a student here at Royal Roads. He's a doctoral candidate in the Doctor of Social Sciences, and also a graduate of a program that I used to lead called the Disaster and Emergency Management Program, the Master's Program. Importantly, he is also a paramedic and a manager of disaster risk and resilience at BC Emergency Health Services, BC Ambulance, better known as. And he's working in his doctoral work to support BC Ambulance better understanding how they can adapt to these kinds of complex challenges like climate change. And he'll bring to this talk, I'm sure, some of that research, but also some of his perspectives, having lived through the heat dome as a paramedic and somebody working in emergency health services. Today, we're also very fortunate to have Rachel Lafortune, who's a researcher with the Environment and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. She did some excellent work around understanding the heat dome and the extreme heat from the perspective of those many people who are most vulnerable in these contexts, and really focusing on these events, heat and others, as human rights violations, really, when we are not supporting those who are most vulnerable in the context of such events. And I know we're going to have a rich discussion about that. And last but not least is George Benson. He's a climate leader and an urban planner in Vancouver City. He serves as a managing director of the Climate Displacement Planning Initiative, which is one of the first organizations and still one of the only organizations in the world to focus solely on climate change and forcible human movement and migration. Huge topic. And I know George is also very involved in economic development and economic analysis. So I know he's going to bring some conversation around the economic and workforce implications of these kinds of events. So we've got a lot of intelligence, expertise, and insights in the room. And I think we'll just launch in. If you've got questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I know Nancy's going to be monitoring that, and as will I. We'll also have time for questions at the end. We're going to do some presentations, have some discussion, and bring you into that discussion and dialogue. I know there's going to be lots of interest in lots of this. So without any further comments from me, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to launch us off. Sarah?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. As I popped in the chat there, I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, where the BC CDC is located, but I think we all need to be very aware of this event that we're talking about today affected all territories in British Columbia. Yeah, this was a doozy. So this is June the 28th. This, on average, across BC was the hottest day of last year. And I want to be very cognizant of the fact that we are talking about hundreds of people who died during this event. At this time last year, hundreds of people were dying because it was so hot. So let's please keep that in our minds as we have these discussions and have them in honor of those people who lost their lives, with hopes that we don't see an event like this in British Columbia again. Not because we won't see these kinds of weather conditions in British Columbia again, we absolutely will, but because we are in a better place and prepared to come through an event like this without another mass casualty situation. So just a reminder, this heat dome was one of the most anomalous, oh, what happened there? Anomalous events ever recorded on the face of the planet in terms of how it compared with typical temperatures in the region. We were looking at temperatures that were fully 15 to 25 degrees above seasonal norms throughout much of the province. And as I stated in the beginning, this wasn't just part of the province, this was the entire province, as you can see in this picture, along with bits of Alberta, a lot of Washington State, and some of Oregon. But really, this was an event that was concentrated in British Columbia. I'll talk quite a bit about this concept of excess mortality. On any given day in the province, there's a pretty predictable number of people who die. That's the green bars you see on the bottom of the plot here. It's usually about 110 with standard deviation of about 20. And because that's such a steady, normal thing, we can use statistical models to predict expected mortality, or how many people we think would have died during this period if the conditions had been normal. And then we compare how many people actually died with that line of expected mortality, or the black line that you see on the plot here, and we sum that up and call that excess mortality. So excess mortality is not a perfect indicator of how many people died because of the hot weather event, but it gives us some statistical insight into the impact of the event. So we see 8 days here in 2021 where mortality was statistically significantly higher than we would have expected. And we can definitely see that as these temperatures go up and up and up, the mortality also starts to increase. Again, as I said earlier, on average, this was the hottest day across the province. And then we see that the 29th is actually the day when there were most deaths. And that's very typical of these extreme hot weather events. You know, the stress on the human body builds and builds and builds until people succumb to that stress. Now, this is a little bit different in terms of numbers from what you've heard reported from the BC Coroner's Service. So I just want to cover why that is. Again, we're looking at this from a very statistical perspective, and the BC coroners are looking at it in quite a different way. So early in the heat, they put out a letter to all the physicians in the province saying, if you have a death that you think may be related to the heat, please report it to us. They can only investigate the deaths that are reported to them. So we had a very high proportion of deaths reported to the coroner's service during this hottest week. Almost 54% of all deaths were reported. Typically, it's more around 30%. But that means that 46% of deaths were not reported. So they never had the opportunity to be identified as attributable to hot weather because the coroners didn't investigate them. So we do have the coroners saying there were hundreds of deaths attributed to the heat. The BC CDC estimates about 740 excess deaths during that period. Overall, these numbers do match up pretty well. What they're telling us is that hundreds of people died because it was extremely hot outside. Now, the distribution of these deaths within the population is important. I think oftentimes there's the perception that the very frail elderly are most at risk during these events, and there certainly are a risk group, but we also have to remember that it's the very frail elderly who typically die on a daily basis anyhow. So in terms of absolute numbers of excess deaths, the largest absolute number was in those 85 and older, and then we see this stepping down across younger age categories. But in terms of the proportional change from what's usual, we did see about 100% increase in deaths across all of these categories, particularly a little bit higher in these younger age categories. So we have to consider that all older adults are potentially at risk during these extreme events, and their comorbidities, which I'm going to talk about down the line, are probably the thing that drives that risk in most cases. In terms of where the deaths were distributed, we had about a 25% increase in deaths in acute care. Some of these people will be people who called emergency services and ended up in hospital and succumbed in hospital, about a 25% increase in residential care. But the big story here is that the vast majority of people died in the community, and that's perfectly consistent with what the BC coroners have found. So in this hottest week, where there have said there were 526 deaths attributable to the heat, that means from the coroner's perspective, the death would not have occurred if it had not been hot out. 506 of those were inside a private residence. And if you've heard me talk before, I apologize. You've heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it every time I talk about this event because it is the most important thing about extreme temperatures. People do not die because it is hot outside, they die because it is hot inside. And it's those indoor temperatures that kill people. That's why all of these deaths occurred in private residencies. So these are data from Abbotsford International Airport is the black line, a home in Abbotsford that has central air conditioning, that's the blue line, and a home that does not in Abbotsford as well. And you can see the heat dome starts here, our temperatures start to climb. Day over day, we see these increases in outdoor temperatures. That has no impact whatsoever on this home with central air conditioning. It just ticks along between a very comfortable kind of 19 and 23 degrees the whole time. Tiny little blip here, but this is very comfortable, very safe human temperatures. On the other hand, this home without air conditioning already had higher temperatures to begin with. That's not surprising. And then as the heat dome hits, the day over day increases in the maximum temperatures in this home really reflect what's going on outdoors, except that outdoors overnight, we're coming down even on the hottest night to about 24 degrees. This is a very high overnight temperature for this region, but this is a safe temperature from a human health perspective. I think there's often, again, the perception that a house will normalize to the overnight temperature outside. It does not do that. It comes down a couple of degrees every night, and then it starts to go up again. So on this day, we're looking at indoor temperatures at a peak of about 40 degrees. Also note that this peak is occurring a couple of hours after this outdoor peak. So the house kind of accumulates heat for a few more hours before it starts to cool down again, meaning that it's hottest when people are going to bed at night. I've drawn this orange line on here. This is new information that's coming out of Health Canada, and I think we'll see this kind of nationally adopted in due time. In general, temperatures indoors under 26 are safe for everybody. There is some risk that starts at 26 degrees for the most susceptible, the most frail. And you can see that's this orange bar here. But then over 31, we are talking about dangerous conditions for anybody who is susceptible to heat. People who are young and healthy are going to be fine. It's not a problem. But you're an older person with diabetes, they're going to start to struggle at temperatures over 31 degrees, sustained temperatures. And if we look at this house, this house is really in danger territory for 4 complete days here over the course of the heat dome. A little bit more on this, a concept of excess mortality. The effects of this heat dome didn't stop when the temperatures went down, and this is something we need to do a lot more work on. It actually hasn't been very well documented with respect to other extreme hot weather events. But if we take excess mortality on a weekly basis, so that difference between what was observed and what was expected based on the statistical models, and we start accumulating it over the course of 2021, we see some really interesting patterns. First of all, let's look at this line for the 69 or the 60 to 79-year-olds. So mortality is already accumulating into the year. Under normal non-pandemic circumstances, we'd actually expect this to be pretty flat, but this was pandemic. And then there's a big jump at the time of the heat dome, and then it continues to go up. If we had followed the pre-heat dome trajectory, it would have gone like this dashed purple line. These lines are pretty much parallel. There's a little bit of a shift in increased upward excess mortality that could be driven, by changes in the pandemic at that period. If we look at the 80+ line, we see quite a different story. So first of all, pretty flat coming into the heat dome. Indeed, if we'd followed that trajectory, this is what it would have looked like. A big jump at the time of the heat dome, and then it goes up and up and up and up. So the hypothesis here is that the heat dome did injury to susceptible people, particularly older people, that later resulted in mortality. So they survived the heat dome itself, but went on to sort of succumb to those injuries, or those injuries contributed to other things that led to their death in the weeks and months that followed. We've done a couple of big studies on the deaths during this period. One of them was looking at neighborhood factors for community deaths in the Lower Mainland only. So this doesn't cover the whole province. Most of the deaths were in the Lower Mainland, though they occurred everywhere throughout the province. And here we want to look at things like neighborhood deprivation and neighborhood indicators of the urban heat island effect. We compared people who died in the community during the heat dome with people who died in the community at the same time of year in other years. And when we map out the data in this study, this is how things look, kind of comparing the heat dome with those deaths in prior years. So we see a very big impact in New Westminster, where we have quite a concentration of low cost, low quality housing, older walk up, 3-story, 4-story buildings, some of which would still have a lot of single pane windows in there, increasing the greenhouse effect during the summer solstice, which is really when this was occurring, just after solstice. We also have a south-facing slope down to the Fraser River, so we're going to get a lot of solar gain in this region. You can see effects through Burnaby, East Vancouver. Certainly the downtown east side was impacted, but again, we're comparing people who died in the community during the heat dome with people who died in the community during normal periods, and there's quite a high rate of community deaths during normal periods in this area, so it doesn't pop out quite the same way. We see some effect all the way through the Fraser Valley where it was quite hot. And then when we get to these coastal areas that they're light yellow, we don't see them as impacted. When we put everything together in statistical models, what we find when we compare everything to areas with normal material and social deprivation is that those materially and socially privileged areas, there really was no effect. In areas with material privilege but social deprivation, we start to see an increase in risk, about a 50% increase, although it's not statistically significant, it's pretty close. In areas with material deprivation and social privilege, we see almost 100% increase in risk, and that is statistically significant. And then when we looked at those materially and socially deprived neighborhoods, we see almost a 200% increase in risk. So these deaths were not uniformly distributed among the population. They were concentrated in neighborhoods where there is deprivation, particularly material deprivation, but the combination of material and social deprivation makes things worse. On the good news side, we did see that coverage with the tree canopy did reduce the risk. So 5% more tree canopy was associated with about a 10% reduction in risk. And that's still accounting for these differences in deprivation across the region. So what that's really telling us is that tree canopy matters. It matters in non-deprived neighborhoods. It matters in deprived neighborhoods, no matter where you put it. It matters. So again, a real indicator that tree canopy is something that we should be considering, especially in these high deprivation neighborhoods. The other study we did was looking at the individuals who died during the heat dome across the province and comparing them again with individuals who died during typical summer weather across the province, to see where there were similarities and differences. And in this case, we have split the deaths during the heat dome into those that were potentially heat related, so those that the coroners are still investigating, and those that were not heat related, so those that have been assigned a cause of death that has nothing to do with the heat. Again, we have a little bit of a difference in terms of the total excess mortality estimated and the number of deaths that have been attributed to the heat. We know there's going to be some heat-related deaths in the group that we're calling non-heat related. And you can see that here when we look at schizophrenia. So this is by far the most important risk factor for death during this event. We have almost a threefold increase in risk for those heat-related deaths or potentially heat-related deaths, and we still have a big increase in risk among those non-heat-related deaths. So we need to communicate very clearly with people who have schizophrenia about the risks associated with these events. There were about 100 people with schizophrenia who died during this period. Now, also among the heat-related deaths, we see depression as another risk factor, and substance use disorder and diabetes sort of very close to being significant, but just over the line here. We don't see that for depression, or sorry, for the non-heat related deaths. We see diabetes as important in both groups here. And then asthma was also important in the non-heat related deaths. We do have to remember that there was very poor air quality in the Greater Vancouver region at this time, so that probably contributed to some of these respiratory deaths. Then we go down, there's a whole bunch of places where we don't see an effect, and then we see a bunch of places where the risk was lower than we would expect it to be compared with prior years, particularly in a couple of these cardiovascular outcomes, and especially if we look at dementia. So dementia is kind of the analog of schizophrenia here. And the hypothesis is that people with dementia are cared for. So somebody's got their eyes out, they're looking out for folks with dementia when they know that we're under extreme hot weather events. So if we take all of this and we break it into themes, for risk factors, the number one thing is going to be indoor heat, lack of climate control or air conditioning. Mental illness is obviously a big one. Social isolation, substance use, deprivation, and diabetes. In terms of protective factors, indoor cooling of some kind, air conditioning, heat pumps, what have you. If it's cool indoors, you are safe. Privilege, green space, social connection, and being in care. Hopefully this is starting to paint a pretty stark picture for you of the types of people who are at risk and the types of people who died during this event. Now, a little bit of what we've done to make sure that outcomes, or at least to hopefully so that outcomes are better next time. First of all, this is not a problem that any one group of people can solve. This takes individual level preparedness, family preparedness, community, municipality, provincial, national, and there has to be work done at all of these levels to get a population ready for and resilient to future extreme hot weather events. And we just have to work together to do this. So, I don't know how much Brooks will talk about it, but he and I and many, many others have been sitting on the BC Health Effects of Anomalous Temperatures Committee, or the BC Heat Committee, for months now to put together the new BC Heat Alert and Response System, which was launched at the beginning of the month. This provides a framework for defining a heat warning, which is kind of very hot weather, and an extreme heat emergency, which is what happened in 2021, and then helps to provide a framework for planning around those two types of events. So in the case of a heat warning, here's the things that public health agencies should do. In the case of an extreme heat emergency, here's the things that public health agencies should do. And having a system like this allows our partners also to kind of do planning in this way so that we have a more coordinated and holistic response to extreme hot weather in the province. Again, we're now working under a two-tier system that distinguishes a heat warning, which is what we had over the weekend. That means it's very hot out, hotter than normal. There is some risk, versus an extreme heat emergency, like what happened in 2021, which means it is dangerously hot out. There may be hundreds of deaths again, and we do need to communicate about those two situations in different ways. In the event of an extreme heat emergency in future, we would be able to use broadcast intrusive alerting. So the kind of Amber Alert that you get on your phone, if there's a child missing, that sort of alert would also be sent to let you know that very dangerous hot weather is coming. We all worked hard on the extreme heat preparedness guide. This is a tool that individual and families can use to prepare for extreme hot weather when it comes, the same way they might do for earthquakes or flooding. This is another extreme kind of event that people need to do some thinking about in advance. A real focus on on indoor temperatures and evaluating whether or not you can safely stay home if another one of these events occurs. And finally, just to introduce you to some work that we've been doing at the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health, which is how to check in on people when it's extremely hot. We certainly have people who might connect with others who are at risk in their homes, but they might not be experts on identifying heat-related illness and interventions for heat-related illness and high indoor temperatures. This is just a 5-page guide to walk lay people through how to do a good health check during an extreme hot weather event. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. I feel like I've already yabbled on a little too long, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We will move on. There's a ton of information there, and I know that we'll be sharing these PDFs of these presentations so that folks can take a look at them. Just a couple of quick questions before we move on to Brooks. There was a question about what temperature should a well-insulated house normalize to in heat. I was referring back to your comment about 24 degrees, but do you have a quick response to that?
I think what we need in Canada are standards for what indoor temperatures should be. 26 is safe for everyone. Again, there may be a little bit of flexibility on the high end of that, but we definitely need to say it's not okay for indoors to be over 31. So between 26 and 31, I think there's some negotiating that needs to happen, but there's a quote from me, I think, coming out on CBC saying we should not be able to build houses that get so hot that people die in them. That's not okay now.
Yes, thank you for that. And also just another quick question, well, I think it's a quick question before we move on, about how you did the analysis and whether was it by small scale neighborhood, or how did you analyze the data that you were referring to? I think that was the data in Vancouver in particular.
Yeah, that analysis was done at the local health area level, but the information on the deprivation was done at the dissemination area level. So the smallest unit of the Canadian census, usually about 700 people in a dissemination area.
Great, thank you for those. All right, so I want to turn it over to Brooks to get your take, Brooks, on sort of an on the ground experience and also on the research that you have been engaged in as you think about this kind of event and its implications in particular for BC ambulance and emergency health services more generally. Brooks?
Thanks, Robin. I think just before I start, I'd like to just talk a little bit about what Sarah mentioned with the heat committee and the leadership that Sarah and Jamie Galt from the Ministry of Health have provided, and this whole of government looking at the different health authorities and looking at our organization, the Center of Disease Control, backed by evidence and science and subject matter experts. I think that we as a group have looked at this as potentially a way forward in a collaborative effort to look at other disasters beyond heat, and it's a great model, and I'd just like to acknowledge Sarah's leadership in that group and her continuing leadership and moving this forward. She's a fantastic person to work with. All right, so let me see if I can share my screen and do this effectively, this most stressful part of all these things. Let's see here. Is that, you guys see that? Excellent. Yeah. All right, so let's see here. So the heat dome of 2021 and how it impacted BC EHS. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the Coast Salish lands, and I acknowledge that these homelands and recognize and respect the Indigenous people as the original peoples of these lands. Looks like Sarah and I used the same slide. This is a NASA slide talking about, this is the June 28th temperatures, and just looking that it was one of the most extreme heat events ever recorded. Not just North America. And one of the reasons is because it was so many standard deviations above the norm. It didn't cool down at nighttime, the duration. And it's not because it was the hottest place on the planet, it's because it stayed hot for such a long period of time and was way hotter than it should have been for this part of the world. So some of the ways it impacted us as an organization. So this graph is showing the amount of calls coming into dispatch. So we have, this is not the unique events. This is just the pressure on our system as people try to call. And as people try to call our systems and it starts to get overwhelmed, people have to wait to actually talk to a dispatcher because we just don't have a system, both technologically, meaning that the phone lines, we've now increased our capacity to handle more volume, but also just the physical time it takes for someone to answer a call, process the information, and dispatch an ambulance. So previous to the heat dome, our world record for calls and dispatch was 2,500. We had 6 days over 2,500 calls, peaking out at 3,600. So it's just showing how overwhelmed we are in our input of people trying to get a hold of BC EHS. This line shows the type of calls. I won't get into too many details about how this works, but basically what this is showing is that purple is our highest acuity and red is our second highest acuity calls that we do. So purple would be like a cardiac arrest. Well, we had on the 20th and 29th, we also had our highest recorded number of cardiac arrests in the history of our organization that we've been recording it. But we can see this huge bump this outlier event of purple calls, and then the red calls over here. And these yellow calls, which are less acute, it's not that we didn't get a lot of acute calls. The other one was how many calls are coming in, is when we responded. So we were so overwhelmed that we weren't able to respond to those yellow calls until later. So you can kind of think of it as like a traffic light, red with purple, actually one extra color above, and then blue being at the bottom. That's showing that it's moderate level, but we were just so overwhelmed at the time. Offload delays. This is showing how much time we spend at hospitals. So we only have about 500 places to put people in our ambulances in the entire system. So when we fill up, we stop being able to do pre-hospital care. So this slide is showing what happens when the hospital system gets clogged up and we get stuck at hospitals, unable to get free to go to the next call. And I'm not sure if this was a world record, but it probably was. So over here on the right-hand side, if this was a let's say whatever, a Tuesday, another time of year, this amount of offload delays would have created all kinds of waves in our organization. There would have been meetings with chief officers of hospitals and all kinds of conundrums. So it's showing that this was quite an outlier event where we had hospitals not being able to free up our paramedics to go and do calls. At the time, it was also one of the busiest weeks of overdoses in our system. We didn't know that the record would be broken later, but at this time, it was a record-breaking week. I think this is important to show because this is showing our out of service hours. And this is raw data that hasn't been adjusted. So it's not quite comparing apples and apples as we move along here, and I'll explain why as we go along. But this is just to show the pressure of staffing. And it's not unique to BCHS. Everything from, we've all been hearing about trying to travel at this time in history and going to airports, hospital systems, just finding staff in general is a problem. So it's not unique to us, but it's a pretty interesting bit of information I put together here. So the start of the pandemic, we were running at about 500 hours per day of out of service, just people booking off because they're sick or injured their shoulder or ambulance caught fire, who knows, whatever. That's just average. Then we see the pandemic starting, and then you see this number drop quite a bit. There was a couple reasons for that. One is Bonnie Henry announced an order that paramedics and healthcare professionals in general could cancel their vacation with no penalty. So they would not lose their vacation time. Plus, people had nowhere to go, and altruistic reasons, people came to work more often. And then we see this is the wildfire season of 2020, not that impactful. Second wave of COVID, now we can see that we're double our out of service hours. And then we get into November, and this is, we started having more ambulances in our system. So this out of service from here is not quite the same comparison because there's about 660 hours added into our system here. And then we see the third wave, but it is still steadily increasing to 1,400 hours. Just before the pandemic, I don't know if everybody remembers, but we're also trapped inside of our health authorities. You couldn't travel. If you're in Vancouver, I understand Vancouver, Lower Mainland Health Authority, you couldn't move. That had just lifted just prior to the heat dome. And we had very high call volumes in our dispatch and our system as people were like, oh, I'm going to get my motorcycle out. I'm going to go, to a festival. I'm going to go do things. All this sort of pent up demand just created extra volume for us. Then we had the heat dome, the Linton fire. We had one of our stations burned down. Fourth wave of COVID here. You can now see that it's, we're getting quite a bit of more out of service hours. There was also another type of reporting that started here. So again, the data isn't showing the adjustments. And then we have the atmospheric river that happened, the fifth wave. And if this were to continue on, it actually goes a little higher. So we're in a much more fragile state than we were prior to the pandemic and the heat dome moving into this summer. So what does that mean? That means that we have less resiliency and to be able to absorb future impacts. And we saw some of that this weekend, actually, where we saw an increase in call volume, again, for those pent up demand reasons of people wanting to be outside and go to marathons and parades and whatever else happened this past weekend. Let's see here. Just really quickly, our organization deals with emergencies all the time, and we're really good at it. And what the space that we're working in for the heat dome or in the disaster and catastrophe stage. So an emergency, you can draw a circle around it. We do cardiac arrest to a bus crash every day. A disaster is uncontained, widespread situation where something like the atmospheric river, where if you sent a bunch of ambulances at the atmospheric river, it wouldn't do any good. It might even make things worse. And then the catastrophe is like if maybe the heat dome was a catastrophe. It's so destructive that things don't return to the way they were. Like if the earthquake that turned Richmond into a swamp and pushed Vancouver Island off into the ocean, that type of level. And I don't know, I would say that BCHS and the health system in general maybe has not recovered from the heat dome. So it might be considered a catastrophe. And we're approaching it in different ways. So a linear problem or a tame problem, like when we have a patient, they're well-defined, there's a stopping point, there's a right or wrong. If we don't know what's wrong with the person, we call it NYD. Not yet diagnosed. We try a bunch of different things. If we still can't solve it, we put them in the back of the ambulance. We call it diesel therapy. We push the gas pedal harder, and we get them to the hospital. When we're talking about these climate change type of situations, those are wicked problems, and they're interconnected. And it takes these approaches like working with Sarah and team to have ways of disrupting it. And they're intractable, but you want to reduce disaster risk as opposed to solve it. And you want to minimize it. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but let's try. Can you guys hear that?
Sorry, Brooks, no.
Thank you. Let's try that again.
A wicked problem is a complex social problem, with some being worse than others. They are difficult to solve because there is incomplete knowledge, too many opinions involved. They are interconnected with other problems. They resist resolution, and they are a large economic burden. So what is a wicked problem? They have no formula. They bleed into each other. There's always more than one explanation. Solving one can reveal or even create another. They are unique, and each solution is a one-shot attempt, so there's no room for trial and error. Wicked problems are far too complex to be fixed. However, they can be reduced, influenced, disrupted, and directed. A wicked problem.
So what makes it a disaster for BCHS, for our organization? Critical infrastructure issues make it a disaster for us. We saw this during the atmospheric river and other supply chain issues happening from COVID. Patient destinations, if hospitals fill, like I was trying to show with that other slide, if we don't have a place to put people, then we stop being able to provide services. And then with the heat dome, it was a classic kind of patient surge where we had an overwhelming amount of patients, but we also had the pandemic overlying it, where we had this complexity of patient care with extra protective equipment, the length of calls. So that actually added to our each call took longer. Each call was more complex because of the pandemic complications. And then, of course, the legacy of the catastrophe part of it, not unique to us, but that staffing crisis that we're continually on. Couple of other things I just wanted to mention is that, as a province, not only we're working with groups like Sarah's group, but there's also a modernization of the emergency management legislation, and that's using things like the Sendai framework and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And I just have one more slide. And looking at the goal of a disaster risk reduction. So this is this idea of a wicked problem where you want to reduce disaster risk, and it's prevent new and reducing existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive programs that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disaster, increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. And And so I hope that you heard that in Sarah's slide. I hope that you're hearing that in my work and everybody else that's talking here. And the Sunday framework has 4 priorities: understanding disaster risk. So we've gone through a lot of work in our organization to understand what a disaster means for us, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. That's very important. That's ongoing work for us, and that's getting our whole system to respond. Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. The bane of anybody that works in government is trying to get some of those dollars. We're working hard, and to enhance disaster preparedness for effective response, and to build back better recovery, rehabilitation, restructuring. So build back better might be physically a building, but what we're talking about here is those processes and systems to prevent having not the higher temperatures, but the excess mortality and morbidity that are associated with these events, especially when they're disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups, as Sarah had pointed out, the different groups that are vulnerable to heat. I think that's the end of it. Thank you. Okay, great. I'm going to stop.
Thank you so much, Brooks. Again, lots of food for thought. I mean, you know, from Sarah, we've heard how exceptional the event was and the impact that the event itself had on particularly those with mental health issues, schizophrenia, and other mental health issues, on the aged, those living alone in community, etc. And from you, I think this really important lens of complexity you mentioned in your graphs, in your many graphs, you know, that this is not happening in isolation. The heat event overlaps with the opioid crisis, overlaps with wildfires, overlaps with other things, creating this constellation of demands on organizations such as yours, and this idea of wickedness. These are not simple things to solve, but that they require, yes, what you've discussed in terms of this integrated analysis and planning by groups. And also this integration, your last comments about integrated and inclusiveness being built into this idea of building back better, obviously also including climate projections into building back better. But I think it's a nice segue to you, Rachel, because I know you're going to speak to us about maybe not so much on the numbers side, but around how this event unmasks, illustrates, as all disasters do, how vulnerability is constructed. And it's not, you know, I use that word constructed because it's not just, oh, you're automatically vulnerable, but we make choices in society that create greater or lesser vulnerability for folks. So I want to turn it over to talk to, your perspective from a human rights perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. And thanks also to Sarah and Brooks, who really, perfectly set the stage for me in laying out that data so well. And thank you, Nancy, for agreeing to help me out with the PowerPoint and slides. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today to share a bit about the research that Human Rights Watch did on last year's heat dome. And in particular on the ramifications, as Robin was saying, of governments failing to undertake inclusive climate impact planning, and to talk a bit about some of the gaps that remain to be addressed in BC specifically. First off, for those of you who might not be familiar with Human Rights Watch, we are a global nonprofit working to investigate and expose human rights violations around the world. We currently work in just over 100 countries, including Canada. And last year, in the wake of the heat dome, seeing the alarming death toll in BC, we decided to investigate the impacts of the climate change exacerbated heat and of the government's response, and to look particularly at impacts on people with disabilities and older people. We chose to focus on people with disabilities and older people, knowing that they are at increased risk of adverse heat impacts. Some are more likely to have health conditions or use medication that can affect the body's ability to respond to heat. And people with disabilities and older people also disproportionately experience social isolation and poverty, which increase heat-related risks. But we also picked this focus because under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, both the federal and provincial governments have an obligation to ensure equal rights for people with disabilities, including older people with disabilities, and to ensure their protection and safety during natural disasters. Next slide, Nancy, thanks. So in October last year, we released our report based on interviews with people with disabilities and older people in BC, along with service providers, health officials, and written responses from government. And our research showed that people with disabilities and older people had not been included in government climate adaptation or heat response planning at either the local, provincial, or federal level. And that as a result, supports that they needed to live through the heat wave in both dignity and safety were not available to them. Government efforts at the time focused on access to public cooling centers as the main resource for people to escape from the heat. But for people who have complex medical needs or face mobility challenges, getting to a cooling center, even in places with accessible public transit, is just not feasible. Instead, they were left to cope with the heat alone, often in apartments that were poorly ventilated and insulated, with no access to cooling, often living in SROs or subsidized housing units that cannot be outfitted with cooling, or where they could not access cooling because they could not afford the cost of buying or operating a cooling device. And then where people were facing crisis and needing to seek medical attention, as Brooks laid out, emergency medical services were not in a position to handle the volume of need during the heat dome. My colleagues and I spoke with one woman, for example, whose 88-year-old aunt who used a wheelchair died as a result of the heat dome and had been unable to get through to 911. And we know this is just one example of numerous others reported by the news media. Ultimately, our report concluded that the absence of a coordinated response to the heat wave, along with a lack of access to cooling and targeted supports, contributed to unnecessary suffering and possibly deaths. The recent coroner's report that Sarah spoke to a bit also aligns with our research findings, showing that roughly 90% of those who died were 60 or older, and that 91% had a chronic physical or mental health condition. And as Sarah importantly highlighted, that high indoor temperature was the primary cause of death, with most deaths occurring inside private residences, and with most of those who died lacking access to cooling. But this data is really only one part of the story, and it does not account for those who almost died or who faced serious impacts on their physical and mental well-being as a result of the heat and lack of adequate response. People that myself and my colleagues interviewed told us how the heat caused significant physical pain, serious fevers, loss of consciousness, difficulty breathing. But we also heard how the heat impacted mental health. We heard about trauma, anxiety, agitation, and depression, not only because of the heat exacerbating underlying conditions, but also because of the uncertainty and fear experienced about being able to survive the heat dome and anticipation of surviving future climate impacts. So in that vein, I wanted to share a few testimonials from people that we interviewed. Next slide. This is from Ember, a 69-year-old woman with a disability who lives in a subsidized unit in South Surrey. She said her apartment reached 39 degrees Celsius during the heat dome. She developed a cough and persistent fever. And she told me, "I have never been so sick in my entire life. I have had fevers and colds, but not this dizziness, not the shakiness. I couldn't do anything. I nearly fell off the toilet seat because I was so dizzy." Ember did end up actually taking a taxi to a hospital where she was treated for dehydration and a potential lung infection. Next slide. This is from Edward MacArthur, 55 years old, who has multiple disabilities, is unhoused and lives alone with his 2 dogs. He explained how he had severe breathing problems and difficulty keeping cool because of a spinal cord and brain injury that prevents him from being able to regulate his body temperature. He was in Golden, BC at the time of the heat dome and told us, "I was in fear of my life, that I had to leave the area because we could not find shelter or cooling or remedy. I had to escape to the coast and drive 12 hours through forest fires, only to find further discrimination and no services available for homeless and disabled people." Next slide. So this last testimonial that I want to share with you all is from Gabrielle Peters, a disabled policy analyst and writer who lives in poverty in a subsidized apartment in Vancouver. And her words, I think, really capture a critical aspect of the heat dome impacts that we documented, which is that largely we are talking about completely preventable pain, suffering, and potentially death. Gabrielle shared these particular remarks at the UN climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland last year, saying, There is a difference between facing the prospect of death because it is part of the reality of being human, and the prospect of death because you have been put in a situation where you should and could survive, but have been denied the tools and means to do so. Next slide. So in our assessment of the government response to last year's heat dome, there were 3 critical gaps that we identified. First, a lack of data, and we know that BC is unfortunately not alone in this. Both lack of health data disaggregated by disability, but also just general climate-related health impact tracking. And the reason that this is important is that it means BC can't adequately understand the scale of needs or harms experienced and won't be able to respond effectively to populations at risk. And then second, lack of consultation and planning. There was a general acknowledgement by the BC government and emergency services that they were not prepared, in a sense that officials were taken by surprise, and there was a lack of clear communication of the emergency at hand, and a resulting delay in marshalling an emergency response. There was also a related failure to consult with people with disabilities and older people about their needs and preparing for and responding to known climate impact risks in BC, like extreme heat. Which leads to the third key gap, that government responses did not address the needs of people with disabilities and older people, particularly when it came to access to cooling. Next slide. So here we are, a year down the road since the heat dome, and unfortunately, BC and Canada, both having human rights obligations here, have a lot of work to do to ensure that we don't see a repeat of last year. On data, we do now have the coroner's report, and Sarah shared some data as well. But as mentioned, these are only snapshots and focused on deaths largely. There's no proactive monitoring of climate-related health impacts in place in BC, or even data from the heat dome on other impacts, for example, hospital admissions or social impacts. When it comes to consulting people with disabilities and older people about heat planning, the province did acknowledge this shortcoming to HRW and followed up by hosting some small limited engagements with heat sensitive populations. Unfortunately, these sessions, to my opinion, were quite rushed and limited in reach, and it's unclear how the recommendations from people who shared their perspectives in these sessions will inform government policy, if at all. The BC government has released its new climate adaptation strategy, which includes steps to prepare for and address heat risks. And there are some positive developments in there, including a funding stream for municipalities and First Nations to undertake heat planning and risk assessment. Also the updated heat alert system that Sarah alluded to. However, when it comes to ensuring access to cooling, particularly for at-risk and low-income people, a recommendation made by Human Rights Watch, raised by disability advocates, and raised in the Provincial Climate Secretariat's own final report following their consultations with at-risk groups, the province is really lagging compared to other governments. In the United States, for example, governments have outfitted programs to directly supply folks who are at risk with cooling devices. BC government messaging, however, continues to focus more on individual responsibility and action as opposed to government human rights obligations. These are screenshots from the Extreme Heat Preparedness Guide, part of the province's heat framework, and which focus on telling people to be able to identify cool spots in their home, and if they are not able to guarantee cooling in their home, to find somewhere else to be, essentially, during an extreme heat emergency, which, for people with disabilities and older people, particularly low income people with disabilities and older people, this is just not feasible, actionable, or reasonable. Next slide. So that's a lot of heavy and somewhat depressing content. So I did want to leave things on a more positive note. And just to wrap up, I will just leave you all with this message, which is that we need a systems level change on inclusion, because without dedicated awareness and targeted indicators, people with disabilities and older people will continue to be an afterthought. And that people with disabilities and older people and their representative organizations need to be meaningfully involved in developing climate mitigation and adaptation policies in the spirit of nothing about us without us. This slide shares some of the recommendations that I heard from people with disabilities and older people and interviewing them, an example of the insight and creative problem solving that gets overlooked to everyone's detriment when government processes are not actively inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And, you know, such an important message. We've seen that in the chat as well, this idea that that people from those groups that are most vulnerable need to be included in these conversations. Municipalities need to be included in these conversations. This idea of your last slide of no sort of planning for us without us, which is not a new idea, but we seem to still have to push that forward so often in these contexts. We know what makes people vulnerable. There's a lot of really important research here, but we've had research for decades on what makes people vulnerable in disasters. And the common threads are poverty, lack of access to, you know, inclusion in these kinds of decision-making processes, aging, et cetera, all the things that we know that we keep repeating. So a really important message that I'm sure we'll come back to in the discussion. I want to go over to you, George. I know you've got a similar and different take at the same time, you know, bringing in another population that is often not necessarily thought about when we think about the numbers that we just read, which is workers and how this event impacted workers, and also the economic implications, which is not to diminish the vital importance of the human implications, but the economic implications are also important in terms of how we do this transition in a just way, and thinking about the folks that are most impacted by these events in that sense of a just transition. There's been lots of conversation also around emissions reduction. So I know you'll want to touch on that. Over to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to all my colleagues here. Just some amazing data and insights already provided. I'm quite excited. I think, yeah, as Robin said, I want to be clear that when we talk about the economic implications and costs associated with climate change, those are absolutely and fundamentally secondary to the human health and livelihood implications. However, that said, they're important as well. And they are part of the ways in which we will address climate change. And they're also important in considering the impacts and the challenges associated with climate change. So I want to be very clear that I'm not coming out with this is more important than the very real livelihood pieces that were discussed already, but these are an additional and important consideration to bring in. So I did something very silly in setting my bio in. I wear a lot of hats in my work. And so I'm actually going to be speaking today from the role that I hold as an economic developer. So I work for the City of Vancouver's Economic Development Agency, and there I'm the manager of economic transformation, and I'm responsible for decarbonization and the just transition. So I'm going to be sort of wearing that hat today as I speak to you. If you're not familiar with VEC, we are Economic Development Agency, City of Vancouver, and our role is to support the building of a prosperous, inclusive, low carbon and resilient economy that works for everyone in Vancouver. And that's certainly the lens that I bring to the work that I'm privileged to do. So VEC, as you can probably imagine, in Vancouver, we're based on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I'm going to give you 3 bullets here in the next sort of 8 minutes, I guess. I'm trying to leave some room for questions. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about workers in the context that they live in within climate change. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might look to build a safer environment for workers when it comes to climate change. And I'm going to close with a little bit of just a quick plug for some of the work that VEC is doing currently to think about some of these issues. So let's talk about workers and climate change first. And I have a really fundamental question, I think, that certainly I've been asking myself post the events of last year and going forward, which is how many workers were injured during the heat dome and how many workers experienced a variety of health-related impacts when it came to that event and other climate change extreme weather events. And the answer is, we don't know. It's a very complicated picture, as I think all my colleagues have laid out. We have press releases from WorkSafe BC citing over 100 workplace-related injuries due to climate change over the past 3 years. But as far as I've been able to find, there's no isolated data for workers related to the climate change impacts they face. There's tons of research in the abstract. The US has fairly good data sets, but I'm not aware of any in BC that are specific to either the heat dome or to climate change events more generally. And I think, as we all can appreciate, when you're reporting a workplace injury, there are a variety of reasons why you choose to or not to do so. And so I think it's fairly safe to say that there's a significant degree of underreporting that's probably implicated in that work. What we do know, though, on a fundamental basis is that more and more workers are facing heat and other climate change impact-related injuries. I cited 100 extreme heat-related injuries from WorkSafe BC over the past, 4 years, actually. But that's really the level of granularity. The WorkSafe BC annual report from last year, for example, cited these events, but doesn't include any information related to that. We also know, and I've been trying to get a count together, but haven't yet succeeded. We know that a number of restaurants and other workplaces were closed during the heat dome because they couldn't meet their own level of comfort related to workers and their consumers. Again, we don't have a sense of how many of those folks were. And I think also importantly, what were the levels of internal temperatures that they were facing in those workplaces? I'm not aware of any data sets related to that. And then at a higher level, and I think this is really key, as with many of these sort of economic implications of climate change questions, we know that extreme heat saps productivity. It reduces the level of coherence and overall awareness that many of the workers in these extreme heat events face. And that hurts not only the workplace efficacy, but it creates danger. It creates danger for workers, and that's a really key concern. There's a great piece of research that actually the Union of Concerned Scientists released recently, which tries to understand the archetypes of workers who face extreme heat-related injuries and challenges in the age of climate change. They came up with these 7 archetypes: so construction, extraction, protective services, farming, fishing, forestry, materials moving, installation, maintenance, repair, building and grounds cleaning and maintenance, and transportation. And of those, I think there's a fair degree of analogousness between Canada and the US in those sort of worker segments. 80% of those workers are male. About 45% of them come from Indigenous, Black, or people of color. And collectively, they have about $55 billion of salary that's at risk because of either injury or being unable to work. And again, I don't want to sound crass in saying that that's an important consideration in this, but people's livelihoods impact their health. If they have enough money to buy the medicine and the services they need, they can be healthier. If they don't, they're going to be in trouble. And that's a key consideration I think we need to be really attentive to. We don't have, surprise, surprise, as good a data here in Canada, but the Canadian Climate Institute had this great report on the human health impacts of climate change, which I just stole this really important quote from, which is that in a high emission scenario, climate change could lead to a projected loss of 128 million work hours annually by the end of the century, which is the equivalent of losing 62,000 full-time jobs at a cost of almost $15 billion. Those are very striking numbers. And what's interesting, and I think is always the case when you're talking about these sort of mitigation adaptation linkages, the more we do today, the better off we are tomorrow. Contrasting $14 billion in potential losses with a low emission scenario of only 6.7 is a notable better outcome. Interestingly, and I think we all recognize this, with the baked in warming we're already facing, there's not that much of a difference mid-century between a high and a low emission scenario. But these are still real numbers. These are people's livelihoods. And again, whether or not people have the money they need to buy the things they need has a direct implication to their health and wellness. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom here. My role at the Commission is really solutions oriented. Our job is to think about how we can better intervene in the economy to protect workers, to create resilience in our economic systems, and to lead more prosperous, healthy lives across the entirety of our society. So I'm going to give you a very quick drive-by of a few of the interventions I think are important in this space. WorkSafe BC, surprise, surprise, needs to really think carefully about the work that it's doing on occupational health and safety and worker care. There's a whole gigantic piece of work called the Patterson Report, which includes a variety of interventions to improve and the coverage of WorkSafe BC for workplace injuries and the kind of support they would provide. That has not been fully implemented. There's some pieces that are at play, but as the BC Federation of Labor and others are saying, there's a lot more to be done there. The current WorkSafe BC extreme heat guide is from 2007, and I think it's probably due for a fairly significant overhaul and update. Many of the folks on this call, I'm sure, have thoughts about what they could put into that. I would also say, though, that WorkSafe BC and all of our labor-related agencies and ministries need to have a plan. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Department of Labor actually has a climate change strategy for workers. There is no such document, strategy, or plan at any level of government in this country, and that should make us deeply ashamed. The next thing we can do is, has already been mentioned, we need to radically scale up the investment in our buildings. Many of us, myself included, are involved in a variety of conversations on increasing the resilience and adaptability of our buildings. A really key point, and I think Sarah was touching on this, is that we need to mandate forward-looking climate scenarios for any building that we're constructing. Right now, you have, to varying degrees, depends on the municipality, you might just be able to choose either a historical or a current set of climate data and build your building for that. That means you've already built a building that's not going to work in 10, 15, or 20 years. That's a problem. We need to be very, very clear that people cannot choose their own adventure when it comes to the climate scenarios they use to design their buildings. And then last but not least, we need to retrofit everything. I quote the Pembina Institute numbers all the time: 95,000 single family homes, 118,000 apartment units, and 3 million square meters of commercial and institutional space retrofitted every single year until 2050. And since we're behind, actually, those numbers will be larger. So we have a lot of work to do. Sort of stepping up the scale of complexity, the last one of the last ones I'll offer is workforce transitions. There's so much I could say in here, but the sort of fundamental piece, as I was sort of alluding to with WorkSafe BC, is we need to have a workforce strategy for Clean BC and for the climate protection and adaptation strategy. We don't yet, we should, and I'm privileged to sit on the Climate Solutions Council at the provincial level, and that is certainly a point that I'm very aggressive in making to a variety of our provincial colleagues, who, I want to be clear, do some wonderful work, but we need to give them the political cover that they need to make that case to ministers and others. We need to invest in a just transition. I think that almost goes without saying, but there are a variety of workers who will not only face challenges related to climate policy, i.e. sunsetting of fossil fuels and so on, but also that they will face challenges related to climate change impacts. We need to have a just transition strategy that really underpins that. And finally, in that context, we need to undertake social dialogue with impacted communities. And there's a whole sort of theory that underpins social dialogue, but we need to be really careful and specific about the ways that we speak to communities about how they might transition in this age of climate change. Last but not least, we need to transform our economy. Really easy, right? We need to transform our economy. And that means being really specific and clear about the economic risks of climate change in our planning, all of our planning and policies. I've been really buoyed to see the Bank of Canada and the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions bringing out more and more work. They did some wonderful climate scenario testing earlier this year that really articulates the incredible economic urgency of climate action. And that, I think, is finally starting to make its way into policy, not nearly quickly enough, though. We need to go faster. We need to use tools specifically like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and really leverage the power of our financial sector to drive, to cascade decisions that are climate positive across the entirety of our economy. And in doing so, then we're going to be able to take a whole of economy approach to climate action. And what I mean by this is I often say, if I hear of a dental hygienist who's going to their climate action conference for dental hygienists, I'll know we're on the right track. Like, that's my metric, is that when the people who least think of themselves as having an implication or association with climate action, when they're bought in, we're on the right track. So I've given you a very quick drive-by of all those things. And what I'm just going to close with very, very quickly here, because I want to get to the dialogue, is VEC is on the case. As an economic developer, we are really excited earlier this year to release the Zero Emissions Economic Transition Action Plan. This is a first of its kind plan by an economic developer for the climate emergency. It integrates, crucially, I think, economic development, equity and justice, and climate action. They're not exclusive, they have to come together. And I have some more details on our website if you want to learn more about that, but maybe I'll stop there just in the interest of time so we can get to the dialogue. Really pleased to be able to chat with you all today. And if you want to get in touch, there's some of our info, and I think Robin will be passing along these slides. So thank you so much. Absolutely.
Thank you, George. And again, I think just again, so much information that alone could be a webinar, and just to discuss how are we planning for and with workers in this context of climate change, and where are these gaps? And I've heard throughout all 4 presentations, both some things that we are doing differently, some lessons learned, as there often is following a disaster like the heat event and the heat dome, and also some serious ongoing gaps. So I guess, and there's lots of rich conversation in the chat. Some of it's been about emissions reductions and obviously the importance of that to this very topic, but also looking at some of these other issues about what we can do. So before we started today, I was in discussion with Rachel, actually, just sort of looking at what what BC has done, and in terms of their, sort of their response to the heat events, and what is there and what's not. And I don't know how freely all of you can talk about that, but I know when I read it, I was pleased to see some elements. I mean, certainly that they are extending the heat alert, which is important, that they are taking some, funding steps with municipalities, but there were also lots of gaps in there, many of which had to do with the populations you've mentioned. I didn't see anything about workers. I didn't see anything about, specific vulnerable populations. A lot of the recommendations really continue to focus on, by my estimation, people with means to do something to their home, people with means to get to a cooling center. I know one of the issues last year, and I don't know if that's been changed, is cooling centers are open during the days. And we had these extreme temperatures at night. There was nowhere to get to. I mean, outside potentially was slightly cooler than inside, or maybe perhaps quite a bit cooler based on Sarah's slide. So where do you think, what would you prioritize? You've mentioned some of these, but if you think about where we're at in BC in particular, but in Canada more generally, what are the priorities? We know that there are priorities across the board to address climate change, and we keep calling for them. At some point, we're going to actually have to do them. So what, if you were in charge of the world, what would you be doing right now to make us less vulnerable to these heat events? And in particular, with a focus on those populations that you've already mentioned. And I'm just going to open it up to any one of you to jump in. Yeah, George, take it away.
I think if I can, I'm like a systems change guy, and my outlook and my question is always like, what's the easiest lever to pull, which cascades the most change throughout the system? And from my vantage point right now, there are a number of laws and directives, which are actually, the great news is those are not financial outlays by the government that for a variety of reasons sees itself as fairly cash strapped. Some of us in the room might disagree with that, but the flowing out of additional cash right now is relatively unlikely. So what are the levers that create that? I would say we need to do a really thorough auditing of all professional practice governance, various laws related to the operation of equipment and materials. Technical Safety BC had its Climate Safety Summit last week. I don't know if folks in the room were able to attend. I had a Climate Solutions Council meeting, so I couldn't go, but I think leveraging some of these like seemingly banal back-end agencies, directives, laws, statutes, et cetera, that's where we could get really meaningful impact. And in the chat, I was mentioning the Residential Tenancy Act does not have a provision for cooling in it. You can be sued for having not a hot enough building, but you cannot be sued for having too hot of a building. That's a problem. Now, and as I said, I work with many of these agencies. I'm not saying let's spring that on the landlords tomorrow, but let's recognize that that's a genuine piece of liability they need to be accountable for, and let's give them the help to get there. I don't think that's an insurmountable goal. And I was mentioning there are tools like property assessed clean energy financing, otherwise, like we can pay for this, it's possible. But I think it starts with like doing that sort of, what are all those levers at the legislative and statutory level? And then we can hopefully cascade that down through the system. And the second thing is we need to spend a lot more money. We need to spend a lot more money. The climate protection and adaptation strategy, I think it says something like about $500 million in new spending. If you really peel back the label, it's probably closer to 80 or 50 even, depending how you count the highway stuff. And again, I work with these folks. They do great stuff, but they have a political battle to fight of who gets what money. And I think we need to all give them a lot more political cover to make that happen. Yeah,
thank you for that. And I mean, that is often the call for more money, but it is so true that prioritizing these things in a preventative and proactive way, I mean, if we can even call now proactive, is going to be critical. Sarah, you had a thought, and then I see a hand raised by David with probably a question or comment. Sarah?
Yeah, just on the money thing, and I raise this every time I'm talking to people in government, is like, we made a lot of money available really quickly for COVID, a lot. This is a much bigger public health threat than COVID, not just heat, but climate change in general. And the fact that we are treating these things so disproportionately, and we're not like releasing funds to get this work done is appalling. So when you're thinking about climate and when you're thinking about funding, you should be thinking about what we already now know is possible, because over the course of 2 years, a lot of money came at a public health problem really quickly.
And we know that climate change is, I mean, certainly in many reports, the #1 global, health threat across multiple things, heat and other events. So yeah, David, you have your hand raised, and I think I can unmute you. Nancy, can you unmute David, please? Do we have?
You should be good to go, David.
David Jones?
Mhm.
No, okay. Well, we'll come back to you if you do have a question. Rachel or Brooks, any other thoughts on this priority of funding and I would hear in what both Sarah and George, you said, a recognition of, beyond a rhetorical recognition of the urgency and the importance of addressing climate change. We seem able to talk about it, but not necessarily invest in the ways that we need to invest very quickly. Rachel.
Yeah, no, I think Sarah and George are spot on with their comments. I mean, I think certainly in the lead up to the most recent BC budget announcement, I think we were hopeful of seeing a lot more support for climate adaptation. And there certainly was a lot of money that went towards that, but obviously more in the context of addressing the impacts of the wildfires and massive climate related flooding that BC saw in the immediate aftermath of the heat dome. And when we look at the numbers of what actually is being funneled towards addressing heat in the province, it's minuscule by comparison, despite the fact that BC saw hundreds of people die, as a result of this heat exposure and lack of preparation. And yeah, thank you, Sarah. But ultimately the heat specific funding was like quite limited, unfortunately. And I think one other point to raise that has, I think been interwoven throughout everybody's presentations is just the way in which response to any type of climate emergency or impact is not just meeting the impacts of that specific emergency, but the way that it exacerbates all of the existing weaknesses, shortcomings, results of historic and ongoing marginalization. Obviously, BC's ongoing housing crisis is a huge part of addressing and preparing for the impacts of extreme heat. People that we spoke to, it's just like unfathomable the way the type of like living situations that folks were stuck in heat traps, essentially, apartments that are tiny, sometimes not even able to open a window because they're essentially soldered shut. They're not allowed to install cooling devices, or even if they want to get a heat pump or some type of cooling retrofit, they live in subsidized multi-unit housing where they don't have control and very little leverage over ensuring that type of change and preparation. And of course, the cost, even where it's possible, is significant, especially when you're on low income or a fixed income. We spoke to people where it's a decision between paying for their medication, paying for food, or paying for cooling.
Yeah, it's so critical. And I'm just going to go back to George, talk about systems change, this deeper systems change that is needed. There was a comment in the chat from Maria talking about, we continue to focus on individual interventions and government, but this need for us to care for each other and build the kind of, social context in which these things matter. these things matter and are resourced and addressed in this way. Brooks, I'm going to hand it over to you for a comment, and then we'll try going back to David, who I think can unmute now, but go for it, Brooks.
Yeah, there's so many things I want to comment on, but looking at investment and looking at our organization. So these heat emergencies and climate-related emergencies don't have to be as impactful on the health and life of people. And by putting more money into BCHS, and I don't want to get in trouble for my bosses here, but putting money into us as opposed to into some of these adaptation strategies and mitigation pieces means that you're putting money into the reaction. And we rely on people to self-identify, and then we only have so much capacity. So investing money into a response organization like ours is important for sure, and we're an important part of society. But really, we want to have that energy and time put into how do we stop people from having to call 911 and protecting people's life and safety. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about Rachel, and you were saying that we don't have proactive ability to report people that are at risk. And I can't remember, I'm paraphrasing what you had said. And I think that, you know, when we look at our reporting, it is really centered around what was their blood pressure, what was their pupil size, what was their core temperature, and we don't have a reporting mechanism that might be able to show the different types of folks, whether it's mobility or socioeconomic or whatever those factors are in a reporting system. And I feel like there's something to be levered and pulled there, because having that understanding allows those governance pieces to change and be better. And I don't have a solution for you, but you know, I can see that people like us could report better. We just don't have the boxes to check.
Well, the boxes to check, and potentially the boxes or something within the system that allows also people to share that information if they want, so to share that proactively, that they may be more vulnerable in those contexts. I don't know, but I mean, I know that what you have said earlier, Brooks, around not only people having to self-identify, but people not being able, that you have a limited response capacity. And so prioritizing some of those folks that we know are going to be more vulnerable in those events, except we don't know exactly what they are. I know there, I want to come back to you, Sarah, in a second, because you made a comment in response to Maria, and it sounded like you wanted to say more, but I do want to give David another chance.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I got a couple of points here, and judging from the comments, the dialogue, and the presentations, both of them are going to be earth-shattering to everyone on this call. I'm a meteorologist that retired in 2017. I worked for the Weather Service for 33 years. And the first earth-shattering question I have is for Sarah, and it's this. Sarah, hi, by the way, it's been a long time. And I'm curious as to what happened to the deadly heat alerting system we established, you at the CDC, the health authorities, Fraser Health and Vancouver Coastal Health, and myself as a representative of Environment Canada after the 2009 deadly heat wave. What happened to it?
You asked that question with 2 minutes left, David, but it's really nice to see you. I thought that might be you, David Jones. That system remained in place. It was triggered last year during the heat dome, but I think what we have to note is that system was internal, in that it was a way to alert the healthcare system and the health authorities that there was going to be an extreme event, but not in a way to alert the population that there was going to be an extreme event. So that's really the big change that we've made this year, is taking some elements of that system so that we can communicate
that's
publicly.
Interesting, because Environment Canada put a process in place that I trained the forecasters to execute, that was to notify the public of deadly heat, and it wasn't done. A warning was issued for a lower threshold, a non-deadly threshold. And so something changed between when I retired in 2017.
Yeah, that all changed in 2018, David, you're right. That changed with the modernization.
Right. And who prompted the modernization? I'm guessing it was Environment Canada.
BCCC, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you've just confirmed for me why I couldn't understand any of the messaging and the fact that no one knew people were going to die 3 or 4 days in advance of that unprecedented system, which by the way, had very little to do with climate change. And the second thing that I was going to talk about was the presumption I'm hearing again is that the atmospheric river was a consequence of climate change. Absolutely not. Nothing to do with climate change. So everyone is directing a lot of energy at events. Number one, the heat wave that will never occur in our lifetime, perhaps for 100 or 1,000 years, and an event that is known to be a problem on the west coast of BC and has seen 2 larger events even in the last 2 decades. So these are not, the heat wave was extraordinary, but extraordinary events happen all the time in weather, and anyone expecting that to ever happen again is dreaming. The atmospheric river, yes, that could happen again. The only thing extraordinary about the atmospheric river was where it landed. And that had been the fear about atmospheric rivers since the report on atmospheric rivers after a conference and a get-together in Victoria in 2013, of which I was a part. It was a known hazard. It was a matter of time
David,
before it happened. So there's
I'm just going to interrupt you here because of timing, and I do want to. It's an important conversation. I'm not sure that everyone would agree with you, and I am hearing from Stacy at PCIC at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, and I know this as well, that these kinds of events will increase. Heat domes will increase in their frequency during climate.
The point is, there is no detectable trend when you ignore the real world and you.
I'm sorry, David, I'm just going to cut you off because I think we could get into a long conversation about this, about whether it's climate change or not. I think where we want to stay focused is that the event happened. These extreme heat events are going to happen more often in the context of climate. Other events are going to happen. And we're dealing with a complex problem, as Brooks described it, a wicked problem, where a lot of things are happening all at once. An increase in extreme weather events, an increase in economic disparities, and an increase in the complexity of systems and their ability to respond to it. So I think that's what we're trying to get at. I kind of don't want to end on that note. So I do want to thank everyone for bringing in their perspectives. I think we're kind of over time, but I'm going to just carry on for a few minutes. If people can hang out, great. If not, this will be in the recording. Because I did want to come back to Sarah. You had a response to this comment about not only a shift in systems that includes, a different direction for funding, potentially more funding around these issues, but this idea that there are other things that we need to be thinking about. It was a comment by Maria, and I can't find it in the chat, but perhaps you want to chime in on that.
Okay, I am going to chime in on, and then I have to go because I'm already super late for my other meeting. Yeah, the comment was around social connection and social cohesion. And this is critically important, I think, and critically important in the context of COVID-19, which has made us more disconnected and uncohesive than maybe we've ever been before. We need each other to get through extreme events. So, I hear this talk of a highly susceptible person sitting alone in their place needing protection. Well, yes, some of that protection could come from a retrofit heat pump in that location, but what's a lower opportunity cost and easier to do in so many ways is some of that protection can come from a network of people around that person who's helping to look out for them and helping to care for them and saying, come on over to my house for the next few days because it's going to be super hot. So I just, there isn't one right solution, but social cohesion has a big role to play here. And that's not only true for extreme heat, it's also true for all kinds of extreme events. And I'm really sorry that I'm going to miss the rest of this conversation. It's been fantastic, but I really do have to go. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, first of all, I'll thank each of the speakers. Thank you so much. You've shared so much information. This could carry on for another hour easily. So for those of you that need to go, Sarah, thank you so much. I see, Rachel, you have your hand up. So we will carry on for another few minutes for those that can carry on, and we'll at least have that in the recording. So thank you, Sarah. Brooks, I'm not sure if you can hang out, and George, but Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to respond quickly to Sarah's point. I think, she's very much right that, providing, access to cooling in the form of individual units for people at risk is one really short-term solution to much broader systems changes that are needed, part of that being issues around isolation and social cohesion. But I would challenge that is perhaps an easier solution. I think something that came up a lot in our research is the ways in which some of that isolation, particularly for people with disabilities, comes from issues around stigma and ableism and very traumatic and difficult experiences with existing networks, particularly with the medical system and healthcare and service providers, ways in which they have been forced into positions of isolation and addressing that and building back from that place of understandable distrust is going to take a lot of work and time. And in the short time, over the short-term period, these people need the tools. They are entitled, have a right to the supports that they need to be able to proactively manage their own climate risks, including to extreme heat. So, support for individual cooling for low-income at-risk people is really essential.
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask you, George, if you have any final thoughts. Brooks, I certainly hear a lot of that sort of, there is no one solution to any of this. We need to think complexly in order to respond to complex problems. And there's going to be both social, technical, immediate and long and short, sort of midterm things that we need to do. George.
Okay, I'll try to be quick here. This comment around the buildings aspect of this, and I'm doing in many we're actually, the VEC is leading a learning tour to Copenhagen this summer with a variety of industry associations, nonprofit housing providers, and so on, to understand how they're doing this work in their context. One of the things that really stands out to me, though, and Rachel, is your comment about sort of individual cooling solutions at the sort of unit scale in buildings. Those are really challenging. They're really, really challenging. And I'm sure you know that, but the solution I would point to in that context is we need to understand scalable models of doing that kind of work. Some folks may have heard of the Dutch model of energy sprong, where you're kind of going in and doing retrofits on a building scale, where you can really keep tenant comfort top of mind. That's one approach. But if we're talking about doing, ideally both, decarbonizing our heating systems, which is our single largest source of emissions when it comes to buildings, and creating resilience vis-a-vis cooling, and air quality for that matter, that has to be a solution that's technically oriented in a way that's scalable, because we will never afford it if we do it apartment by apartment, right? It will totally break down. And then you get into silly things like replacing electrical panels in big apartment buildings. It gets super expensive. So if we can figure out ways to scale that, we can do that programmatically and financially in a much more cost-effective and efficient way. We can reach the level of building retrofits we need to, which is probably on the order of about 5 or 6% of our total building stock every year. We need to be able to get that sort of almost drag and drop level solution. And if we do that at that scale, we can buy the equipment more cheaply. We can purchase contractors and other providers at a level that's effective, and we can do all that. So I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, Rachel, but just to give some color of as to how we would do that, because it's crucial. Those are the first apartments, we should do it. And the last thing I'll say is, I was on a panel a few weeks ago about VC's about to release a heat pump strategy actually for British Columbia. And someone asked me, how should we deal with some of the low income challenges associated with heating and cooling? And my answer is very simple. And I'll say it again: buy poor people heat pumps. That's what we should do. No fancy programs, nothing crazy. We should just buy low-income folks and other vulnerable communities the things that they need. And if we do that, we will build the market that will bring everybody else along. We can make that happen. So buy the folks who need it, buy folks what they need, and then the folks who have the means will follow along. That's my last thought.
Completely agree, George, and would just add that obviously, these types of programs take time, and that in the short term there will be folks at risk who might not be reached by these types of programs. And so then what are the other strategies in terms of evacuation and relocation in emergency heat moments, right? Like what there need to be systems and measures in place. Brooks, maybe coming back to some of what you were saying in terms of what role can emergency services play in reaching at-risk community members, and obviously given sort of the dearth of existing funding and staffing capacity, that immense challenges there as well. But like there are solutions. It's just a matter of funding and staffing them.
And I think that's a great note to end on. I think again, thank you so much. These are such important conversations that we need to be having, even when there's disagreement around what the cause is or what, whether it's related to climate or not. I think it's clear that we're in a context where these are becoming urgent issues that we need to address. There are immediate solutions that we can implement, and there's some long-term thinking that we need to be doing in order to address these, not just immediate, but these larger systems changes, and to have people engaged and included in these conversations. So thank you all for participating. Thank each one of you for your contributions. Hugely live conversation in the chat. So that's an indication of how important your contributions are in this thinking. Thanks all.
Thank you, Robin, for having us.
My pleasure. We'll do more.
Okay, bye, folks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.